Good to be with you as we continue our study on the historicity of the resurrection. As always, as we join together for Bible study, let's begin with morning prayer. I thank you, my heavenly Father, through Jesus Christ, your dear Son, that you have kept me this night from all harm and danger. And I pray that you would keep me this day also from sin and every evil, that all my doings in life may please you. For into your hands I commend myself, my body and soul and all things. Let your holy angel be with me, that the wicked foe may have no power over me. Amen. As always, I invite you to send questions and comments my direction. You can do that at my email address, pastor@villagelutheranchurch.org. I don't really have any questions or comments from our last session that have come in as of yet, so let's just dive into this week's topic. And to do that, let's kind of recap how we have gotten here. We're in our fourth session, so let's kind of get a recap of our first three sessions. And while there were a whole lot of details that came along the way, you could certainly say that here's kind of the basics of what we have picked up. First of all, that Christianity is a historical religion, and there's Pontius Pilate as a great example of that even in our confession of the Christian faith in its most kind of condensed form, that would be the Apostles' Creed, we take note of that Christ suffered under Pontius Pilate. That is a historical statement. And so therefore we set forth that Christianity is a historical religion. That sets it apart from all the other world religions, that its very foundation are historical events with historical people in historical locations, that if you take away the history, Christianity falls apart. Now, in many ways, making that point was kind of a theological argument in many ways. It wasn't really a theological argument so much as it was setting forth theological foundation for the entirety of the Christian faith. Everything rests on its historicity. We also focused on how the historicity of the empty tomb is not an incredulous thing, that's actually what the majority of scholars, both those who are sympathetic to the Christian faith, then also those who are hostile to the Christian faith, hold to as well. A supermajority hold that within scholarship. Roughly 75%, so a 3-to-1 margin here, folks, say the empty tomb is a historical fact that must be reckoned with. The question is, how do you reckon with it? So when you hear statements such as, Jesus didn't even exist, that itself is just ludicrous on the historical foundation, and really scholarship upholds that Jesus of Nazareth was a human being who actually lived. His crucifixion is held as a historical fact by nearly the whole of scholarship. But then when it comes to the empty tomb, even that 75% of scholars hold that that's a historical reality that must be grappled with. So how do you grapple with that? Well, then our third session, we really focused on how the biblical accounts are historically reliable for a host of reasons. And when you compare it to our other ancient texts and the information we have about other ancient events, how the biblical account, the gospel accounts of the life, death, and resurrection of Christ stand out as above all others. Now, that has set things up with a lot of historical argumentation, which is very beneficial. Today we're going to take a slightly different bent, that we're going to get a little bit more philosophical. So hopefully your eyes do not glaze over, and I don't bore you to death as we hit some of these. But really what we're wanting to address is the question about what about miracles? Because for many, they would say, well, this is why I cannot accept the biblical account, because people just don't rise from the dead, that kind of miraculous event. And of course, the gospel accounts have a whole lot of other miraculous accounts that are found therein. Everything from Jesus raising others from the dead to him healing those who are ill, feeding the 5,000, and on down the line. You just can't take such documents seriously when they hold forth the miraculous. Now, why is that? And this is really in many ways to say that you have to dismiss those documents because of the miraculous accounts, that is a philosophical argument. So what are the foundations for making that kind of philosophical argument? And it's what I mentioned last time in passing, that these are a priori assumptions. Now, if you're not familiar with that Latin phrase, let's give it a little bit of definition. So a priori would mean from prior things, or from what is already known. And so there you see a definition that a priori would be something that can be known without experience or sense data. So you don't have to go through an experiment to establish it. You don't have to witness it to establish it, but rather it just can be known apart from that. You get a few examples right there in that definition. If Socrates has more wine than Plato, and Plato has more wine than Aristotle, then Socrates has more wine than Aristotle. Well, that makes perfect sense. And what you're really doing there is basic logic, all right? It's a logical statement. Now, they put in historical figures there, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. That's kind of the line of the Greek philosophers, Socrates, who taught Plato, Plato, who taught Aristotle. But notice, it's not actually taking their specific teachings into account or their historical reality into account. This is just a logical argumentation. Or another one there, 5 is a prime number. Well, that's really a statement of definition. What is a prime number? A prime number is a number that can only be evenly divided by itself and 1. So 5 is such a prime number by definition. Similarly, by definition, brothers are male siblings. Now, you know that a priori. You don't have to go out and check on somebody's brother to figure that out, because it is the definition of what it is. Now, notice you get into all kinds of challenges if you take an a priori assumption and you make it that, an assumption, rather than it being about logic or definitions. Instead, you just make a priori assumptions about historical events, and that's really what we want to focus on now. What happens if you make those kinds of assumptions about historical events? Well, we've talked about some of that before. So, for example, Heinrich Schliemann and the excavations of ancient Troy. And we mentioned that the a priori assumption was always, for the longest time, had been that Troy really hadn't existed, that the Trojan War between Greece and Troy really didn't happen, and therefore it could be dismissed. But then Heinrich Schliemann excavated Troy, and it revealed that actually Troy had a history, that there actually is evidence of the war that took place with Greece and such. Now, of course, when it comes to that, the things that you get from Homer, we know, go beyond what the historical record or the archaeological record can attest to. But nevertheless, the a priori assumption about an historical event was false, because it discounted the historical documents and just kind of went its own direction. Or another one would be a priori assumptions regarding the pyramids. There have been those who have held that it would be impossible for the ancients to have constructed such pyramids for a host of reasons. One, how could they have had the engineering knowledge? Secondly, how could they have done this just because they didn't have the heavy machinery and the other technological abilities that we have to construct such massive figures? How could they have done it? And so a priori assumptions start kicking in there that something else had to be present. Now, some go so far as making some rather huge resulting conclusions to say, well, they had assistance from aliens and such. Now, notice how you get into rather fanciful explanations when you discount the historical record and just make a priori assumptions. Now, it's actually not very difficult. More and more research has been done to show how the Egyptians were able to construct these pyramids. A lot of it was simply by brute force and using ramps and such, along with that brute force of their slave labors and such. And also, the other thing to keep in mind, something that I have had as a recurring theme in this discussion throughout all these sessions is that this is an opportunity to repent of our hubris, this pride that looks down upon the ancients as if they were simpletons and they lacked the intelligence that we have, and therefore they couldn't have accomplished such things, and therefore also their writings are to be discounted because they really couldn't understand such things. This is the sense that kind of this evolution of human consciousness that simply doesn't bear out with the historical evidence. If anything, you might hold to the devolution of human knowledge, that we aren't thinking as critically as the ancients did in a variety of ways. So what about miracles? They just, to discount them on a priori assumptions doesn't make sense when it comes to historical events. You get a couple of pieces of anecdotal evidence there, Troy, as well as the pyramids, but let's go even beyond that. Let's talk about the limits of a priori statements. So on what basis can you limit them? Now, as we mentioned before, a priori statements are actually quite beneficial in a variety of ways. You can do it when it comes to definitions. So what is a brother? It's an a priori statement to say that a brother is a male sibling, because that's a definition. That's helpful. That's good logic. You can also do it with other logical deductions. So that there was the example of the wine that Socrates had more wine than Plato, Plato more than Aristotle. So you can make a logical deduction on the basis of that. But then also you can do this. A priori statements work very well with math. In fact, math is kind of built on having a whole level of succeeding statements that you memorize as you go through school, so that you end up knowing that a priori the square root of 25 is 5, or positive or negative 5, if you want to even get to that point. But that works very well in those realms: logic, definitions, mathematical statements, etc. But what about when you get into other realms? Like, for example, what about sports? How can you make a priori statements about the results of a sporting event because you look on paper and you see this team has this set of skills and this level of ability, this team is far below it, and therefore does it make sense to say team A will most certainly, I can a priori say without any doubt, that this team will defeat that team? Well, that's not the wisest thing to do. After all, one of the great pieces here in our own American experience is what we call the miracle on ice. Now, this is different than the biblical miracle accounts, but this would be an example of where the a priori assumption within the sporting world was, well, the Russians are going to beat the Americans. The Americans can't do this. But yet, nevertheless, it happened. The a priori did not apply there. Now, you can do that with sporting. How about other historical events, like things that have happened in the history of the world? Here's one that I would give you a bit to think about, is the Spanish Armada. And you know, the Spanish Armada in the day was the most vaunted naval force in the world. They were overwhelming in their power and their abilities, the number of their ships, the size of their ships. But if you know your history, the Spanish Armada went down, and they went down hard at the hands of the British Navy. And the reason was because they got caught in the English Channel, where the smaller British ships, more maneuverable, could outflank and outmaneuver the large Spanish ships, and so the British were able to wreak havoc upon the Spanish Armada. And so this great force that on paper could beat anybody ended up being defeated. And actually, it shouldn't have been all that surprising, because it was a repeat of something else that happened in history. This was also what most critically happened when the Greeks defeated the ancient Persians. The Persians had the most vaunted navy in the world, but the problem was they got into a battle with the Greeks within narrow straits once again, and so the smaller, more maneuverable Greek ships could wreak havoc upon the Persian navy, and the Persians again were just wiped out as a result. And that was a huge shift in the ancient world from Persian dominance to the beginning of Greek dominance in the world. Now, the point is simply this: a priori assumptions do not work well when it comes to historical events. And that would include even historical accounts of what happens with miracles. Now, what is the philosophical foundation, though, of saying that miracles just cannot happen? Now, let me get into a couple of philosophers who are foundational for that outlook, and let's see what they actually have to say. The first one would be Benedict Spinoza. You may have come across him before. Spinoza says the following. Spinoza says that miracles cannot happen for a variety of reasons. In many ways, Spinoza was a pantheist, and he says this: the first step in this, as in all other discussions, is to come to a clear understanding as to the meaning of the term employed. Argumentation about whether miracles are possible, and if possible credible, is mere beating the air until the arguers have agreed what they mean by the word miracle. Now that's a little bit of a background that leads into Spinoza. That was not Spinoza himself speaking there, but more of a critical look at what Spinoza has to say, or a critical look at Spinoza's attack upon miracles. Here's Spinoza himself when he says he developed a 4-point argument that he would say make miracles impossible to believe. The first one is this: miracles are violations of natural laws. So, for example, a natural law is that once somebody is deceased, yes, you can resuscitate them, but after a certain period of time, they cannot come back to life. Therefore, resurrection after 3 days, a third-day resurrection, is a violation of natural laws. Therefore, it cannot happen because number 2, here's law number 2. Natural laws are immutable. You cannot change the natural laws. It's just the way that things are. Number 3, it is impossible for immutable laws to be violated. So notice what has been established there is that the natural laws are immutable, therefore you cannot violate them, and therefore, number 4, miracles are not possible. Now, his logic makes sense. The question is, do you agree with every assumption that he made along the way? Now, miracles are violations of natural laws. I'd say number 1, he is correct. Number 2, natural laws are immutable, that they cannot change. I would agree with that also. All right, that the natural laws are set in place, and that's a good thing. We depend on that, actually. It's a foundation for science, that the natural laws are immutable. Also, you and I depend upon it in our everyday life, that the immutable natural laws regarding gravity don't change, and so I don't have to worry about floating off the planet. Also, it is, here's number 3, it is impossible for immutable laws to be violated. Now, notice what that essentially assumes: that the natural laws are themselves the highest arbiter. The question for us would be, can there be something or somebody who is greater than the natural laws, who can operate outside the natural laws without suspending them? Now, you and I cannot do that. But this, by definition, what he's doing is he's precluding the very existence of God. And on what basis? Because he has simply made nature to be divine, if you will, that nothing can be greater than nature. Therein is really where we would disagree with Spinoza, is this assumption behind statement number 3 that he made. And so therefore, he says miracles are not possible. We'd have to say, no, miracles actually are possible, because of who God is. Now, Spinoza is not alone in having this kind of argumentation to say that miracles are not possible. Another one that you may have heard of is David Hume. David Hume very similarly, argues that nature would be supreme. Listen to what Hume writes. A miracle is a violation of the laws of nature, and as a firm and unalterable experience has established these laws, the proof against a miracle, from the very nature of the fact, is as entire as any argument from experience can possibly be imagined. Nothing is esteemed a miracle if it ever happens in the common course of nature. So again, what Hume is doing with his argument to say that miracles are not possible is he is making nature to be supreme. You and I, in our relation to nature, would have to say that nature is supreme. You and I cannot overcome nature and its laws. But from where do those laws come? Again, what Hume has done is he has assumed that there is nothing or no one who is greater than nature and nature's laws, or, if you will, that there's no one who has established those laws and therefore can act outside and beyond those laws if he so desires. Hume is precluding the existence of God. And this is really what the arguments boil down to, is to say, God cannot exist, that nature is supreme. Now, this is where we get down to just a difference in philosophical assumptions. But where do we go from here? Well, you can, in many ways, listen to Richard Whateley. He wrote this article about the historical doubts concerning the existence of Napoleon Bonaparte. And when he wrote this, what he was really trying to do was illustrate that if you take the arguments of Hume or Spinoza and take it to their logical conclusion, you'd have to doubt even the existence of a Napoleon Bonaparte. You'd end up having to say that Napoleon was as much of a non-historical figure as Paul Bunyan, because you have these fantastical tales told of Paul Bunyan that go beyond the pale of what you can expect a human being to do. Therefore, we know it's legend and not true. Well, if you follow Hume's argument, you'd have to end up saying the same thing about Bonaparte. So he wrote this article, Historical Doubts Concerning the Existence of Napoleon Bonaparte, and he's making fun of, it's a satirical outlook upon Hume's ideas. His point is to show that if the skeptic does not deny the existence of Napoleon, he, quote, must at least acknowledge that they do not apply to that question the same plan of reasoning which they have made use of in others. In other words, if you don't use Hume's argument to discount the existence of Napoleon, then you have to at least admit that you're applying a standard to the biblical accounts that you're not applying to the accounts of Bonaparte. So I think the next move there would simply be this. Asking the question, why would they put that kind of standard against the biblical accounts and not against Napoleon? Probably because Napoleon is so recent in human history that to deny his existence would be foolhardy. And also to deny what he accomplished would be rather foolhardy. On the other hand, what about the biblical accounts? Can you make that same kind of statement about the biblical accounts? Well, as we've been arguing along the way, the biblical account, actually, the historical evidence is rather overwhelming. So if you operate on the actual evidence, historical evidence, it's just as ludicrous to discount the existence of Jesus, his death, and even the empty tomb. Another way to look at this is through the eyes of the ancient Greek philosopher Protagoras. He famously said that man is the measure of all things. As we pointed out, both Spinoza as well as Hume, they make nature supreme. But in many ways, it's not really nature that they have made supreme, but it is man who that they have made supreme, at least even their own individual intellect to be supreme, that they are the measure of all things because they have established a logical order that therefore it cannot be violated. And because they have established that, well, that's the argument in and of itself. But notice what that does. It precludes growth of knowledge, that there could be more that you're unaware of, that once you become aware of it, it has to change how you look at things. So is nature in and of itself the ultimate thing that man can know, or is there more that man can learn beyond that from history and such? Now, you can see that this is related to something else that is rather huge in discourse today, and that is the role of what can be called philosophical materialism. That is the philosophical outlook that underscores evolutionary theory and such. What it really boils down there to is to say that nothing exists other than the material, and everything can be explained simply in materialistic terms. So even the emotions you have shouldn't be explained any way other than a result of a surge in hormones within your body and such. Everything is purely materialistic, and it just drains beauty out of life. In fact, if you really follow through with scientific materialism, or philosophical materialism. Also, sometimes this relates to scientism, which is another growing kind of outlook upon the world. But if you get into philosophical materialism, it precludes the category of beauty. Because beauty, as we have understood it, stands on its own, and it's not just a result of hormones within your body. Yes, it may produce that, but beauty actually has a substance and meaning in and of itself. So is man the measure of all things? Or is there that which is beyond man and greater than man? Of course, this gets back to, can God exist? If you have assumed that God cannot exist, you fall in line with not only Protagoras, but you can fall in line with Spinoza and Hume and others as well. But if you recognize that there are some things that go beyond humans and even can go beyond nature, then it opens you up to a fuller picture of human existence. It also sets you up to listen to historical evidence. Now, listen to Wolfgang Pannenberg. He was in the 20th century a rather significant scholar coming out of the University of Munich. And here's what Pannenberg had to say regarding all of the historical evidence and such. He says, the question whether something happened or not at a given time some 1,000 years ago can be settled only by historical argument. So Pannenberg's argument that is rather convincing if you read him in whole is that you cannot just do a priori assumptions to say, well, that's impossible, therefore it could not have happened. But you actually, the only way to settle what happened thousands of years ago is listen to the historical evidence. And what is the historical evidence for the life, the ministry, the death, and even the resurrection of Jesus? Well, that just gets back again to the historical reliability of the gospel accounts. Now, we established that in our last session, but that's also something that we can build on, and that's what we're going to be doing in yet the next session. You can see that we've really come full circle. Everything comes back to the historical reliability of the gospel accounts. You can put it this way, that if you go along with Spinoza and Hume and you discount the possibility of resurrection and miracles and such, what you're essentially doing is you're making philosophical arguments that deny historical reality. And you're, in many ways, you're being intellectually, academically lazy. You're refusing to do the work of actually engaging the historical evidence, but you're just discounting it because it doesn't make sense within the box that you have created for everything to take place in. So this is we're not going to be that lazy intellectually or academically. Let's look afresh at the historical reliability of the gospel accounts and what they actually have to say. That's going to be our topic at our next session. So we continue to rejoice in the historicity of the resurrection. Questions and thoughts, send them to me, pastor@villagelutheranchurch.org. Until next time, the Lord be with you.